The afternoon sun was a pale, watery eye in the gray sky, offering light but no warmth. The city plaza, a concrete stretch between glass and steel giants, pulsed with the indifferent rhythm of a weekday lunch hour. People moved in urgent, crisscrossing streams, ties flapping, heels clicking, the low hum of 100 separate conversations blending with the distant growl of traffic. In the center of it all, looking as out of place as a barn in a boardroom, stood an old public piano. It was a sorry-looking thing. Its black lacquer was a spiderweb of cracks, showing the dull, bruised wood beneath. Several keys were chipped, their ivory veneer long gone, giving the smile of its keyboard a gap-toothed appearance. A handwritten sign taped to the music stand simply read, "Play me," but the words were faded and curled at the edges. An old invitation few ever accepted. Today. Someone had. He was a man of no particular age or note, bundled in a worn olive-green tweed coat too heavy for the cool day. A plain beanie, the color of old asphalt, was pulled down over his ears, and a pair of large, tortoiseshell sunglasses, the kind popular decades ago, covered his eyes. He sat stiffly on the small, attached stool, his shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to fold himself into a smaller package. For the past 20 minutes, his performance had been a quiet background nuisance. He wasn't playing a song, not really. He was teasing out a single simple melody with the caution of someone diffusing a bomb. A note, then a pause. 3 notes in a row, then a stumble, a jarring wrong key that made a passing woman wince. His fingers, clad in fingerless woolen gloves, seemed unsure of their own purpose. The sound that came from the piano was as tired as its appearance. Thin, slightly tinny, the pedal creating a faint, persistent buzz underneath. The crowd, a constantly shifting organism, paid him little mind. To them, he was part of the urban furniture less interesting than the statue of the forgotten mayor nearby. A young courier, balancing 3 paper coffee cups, jogged past without a glance. A pair of shop assistants on their break chatted loudly about a manager, their words slicing through his fragile melody. Coins landed in the black case at his feet with soft, infrequent clinks. A man in a sharp suit dropped $1 without breaking stride on his phone call, a transaction of pure habit. Like paying a toll. 2 construction workers in dusty jeans and high-waist vests leaned against a planter, eating sandwiches from paper bags. The taller one nodded toward the piano player. "Gotta give him points for trying, I guess," he said, his mouth full. His friend snorted. "Points for what? Driven people away? I've heard cats walking on pianos sound better." They shared a laugh, a short, harsh sound, and moved on. The pianist heard it. A slight tightening at the corner of his mouth, invisible behind his scarf, was the only sign. He kept playing, the same hesitant, fragmented tune. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, tugged her mother's hand and stopped to watch, her eyes wide with curiosity. Her mother, hurried and stressed, glanced at her watch. "Come on, sweetie. It's just a man playing a piano." She gently pulled the child away, and the moment of potential connection was severed. This was the life of the plaza. It was a place of transit, not destination. People came to cross it, to get from the office to the cafe, from the subway to the department store. The sounds here were the rustle of paper bags, the scrape of chair legs on concrete from the outdoor seating, the tinny leak of headphones, the fragmented phone conversations. "I'll need those reports by 5. No, the other kind of milk." The pianist's clumsy scales were just another layer in this symphony of disconnection. He seemed to shrink further into his coat. He'd start a slightly more ambitious series of notes, an attempt at a left-hand rhythm, but it would fall apart quickly, dissolving back into single, plucked keys. He looked to anyone who bothered to look, like a man who had found a leaflet for piano lessons once, tried for a month, and now, years later, was bravely and embarrassingly attempting to remember. He was a picture of ordinary, quiet perseverance in the face of obvious public failure. A street cleaner swung his wide broom in long arcs, pushing a pile of discarded leaflets and autumn leaves toward the pianist. He didn't ask him to move. He just swept around him and the piano, an obstacle in his daily route, creating a small, temporary island of untidiness around the performer. The sun dipped behind one of the towers, plunging the plaza into a deeper shade. The air grew cooler. Some of the lunch crowd began to trickle back to their offices. The pianist showed no sign of leaving. He played the same 7-note sequence again, wrong note and all. It was a sound of pure loneliness, a tiny, imperfect signal being sent out and immediately lost in the city's noise. He was a ghost already, a man wrapped in layers of fabric and obscurity, making a sound that left no mark. The open case at his feet held a few coins and a single crumpled dollar bill. It wasn't enough for a proper meal. It was the kind of take you'd get from people who paid not for the music, but to ease their own conscience as they walked away from the slight, uncomfortable reminder of struggle. He paused, letting the last wrong note fade into nothing. He stared at the chipped keys, his gloved hands resting in his lap. For a long moment, he was perfectly still, a frozen figure in the moving city. He took a deep, slow breath that shuddered a little as he inhaled. It was the breath of someone tired, someone perhaps resigned. He looked like he might pack up. He looked like he might finally give in to the invisibility, to the quiet dismissal of the crowd, and become just another man walking away, defeated by the sheer, busy indifference of the day. He lifted his hands again, hovering them over the yellowed keys. He was about to begin the same simple, broken tune once more. It was a moment thick with the mundane, the unremarkable end of a small, sad attempt. Nothing about him suggested what was to come. He was just a man in an old coat on a cold plaza, playing a broken piano very, very badly. The story, it seemed, was already over, and it had been a boring one. The air in the plaza had settled back into its usual rhythm, a blanket of low chatter and foot traffic. The pianist's faltering melody was a barely there thread in the fabric of the city's noise. A few people had stopped, not for the music, but to check their phones or wait for a friend, using the piano as a landmark. They stood with their backs to him, scrolling, completely unaware of the man on the stool. One of them was a woman. She was dressed for an office, in a sharp, knee-length coat and comfortable but nice-looking shoes. She held a paper salad bowl in one hand and a plastic fork in the other, eating with the focused speed of someone with a short lunch break. Her face, which might have been kind in a different moment, was pinched with a day's worth of small frustrations, a missed email, a rude comment in a meeting, the persistent ache in her lower back from her desk chair. The pianist hit the same wrong note again. It was a flat, sour sound that seemed to hang in the air longer than the others. The woman's shoulders tensed slightly. She took another bite of salad, chewing mechanically, her eyes on the middle distance. The playing started up again, the same short, sad little climb of notes, and the stumble dot, it was the third time. The third time he'd reached that part of whatever simple tune he was trying to remember and failed. A deep sigh escaped her lips, a cloud of visible breath in the cool air. It wasn't just annoyance. It was a strange, sudden feeling of impatience mixed with something else, a weary disappointment. The world was full of so much noise already, she thought. Did it have to be such awkward noise? She turned around, her lunch forgotten for a second. She looked at the figure hunched over the keys. He seemed so closed off, so wrapped up in his own world of wrong notes. There was no joy in it, no feeling. It was just a mechanical repetition of failure. Without really thinking, the words came out. They weren't shouted. They weren't even that loud. But in a small lull in the plaza's hum, they were clear, spoken directly toward him. "Do you actually know any real music?" As soon as she said it, she felt a small shock in her own chest. It sounded harsher out loud than it had in her head. She hadn't meant to be cruel. She wasn't trying to be one of the sneering construction workers from earlier. She was just tired. Tired of the half thing, the almost try. It was a question born of the city's constant demand for competence, for results. If you're going to do a thing, do it. Or don't. But don't linger in this painful public middle ground. The pianist's hands froze. The awful, incomplete melody was cut off, leaving a sudden ringing silence that felt louder than the music had been. A few of the people nearby who had been ignoring him now glanced over, sensing a shift. The woman stood still, her salad bowl feeling heavy in her hand. She wondered if she should just walk away, melt back into the crowd. She had probably just ruined this poor man's day. For a long moment, the man on the stool didn't move. He didn't look up. He just stared at his hands, resting on the chipped keys. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. The woman opened her mouth, maybe to mutter an apology, but no sound came out. Then he moved. It started with his breath. He took a deep, slow inhale, his shoulders rising. It wasn't the shaky breath from before. This was different. It was a gathering of strength, a filling of the lungs. He held it for a second, and then let it out in a long, controlled stream. He lifted his head. He still didn't look at her, or at anyone. He looked straight ahead, at the faded "Play Me" sign, but he wasn't really seeing it. He slowly pulled his hands back from the keyboard and let them drop to his sides. There was a deliberate quality to the movement, like a dancer finding their starting position. He rolled his shoulders back, a smooth, practiced motion. The slumped, folded-up posture fell away. His spine straightened, and he seemed to grow taller on the little stool. He wasn't a man trying to hide anymore. He was a man preparing to meet something. He brought his hands back up, but he didn't place them on the keys right away. He held them in front of him, fingers loosely curled, and gave them a single, slight shake, not from nerves, but from release. Like an athlete loosening up, the woman with the salad took an unconscious step back. The quiet, bored people nearby had fully turned now, their phones lowering. No one was leaving. Something was happening. It was in the air, a tension you could feel. The construction worker who had been eating his sandwich earlier was still there, watching from a few yards away. His food forgotten, the pianist's gloved fingers hovered for a final second above the yellowed ivory. Then, with a certainty that seemed to belong to a different person entirely, he placed them. Not on the simple middle notes he'd been pecking at, but down low, on the deep, left-hand side of the piano. He pressed. The sound that came out was not a note. It was a statement. It was a deep, resonant, complex chord that seemed to start in the very belly of the old piano and vibrate up through the wood and out into the plaza. It wasn't thin or tinny. It was rich and full of shadows and weight. It didn't just reach the ears. You felt it in your chest. That single chord swallowed every other sound, the traffic, the distant siren, the chatter, and replaced it with a profound, waiting silence. It hung in the air, vibrating, decaying slowly. In that silence, the woman's mouth was slightly open. Her question, "Do you actually know any real music?" echoed stupidly in her own mind. The answer was in the air, in the vibration still humming in the piano's strings, in the transformed posture of the man on the stool. Then his other hand moved. It flew to the higher keys, not with hesitation, but with the speed and grace of a bird taking flight. A cascade of notes tumbled out, pure and silvery and heartbreakingly sad, weaving around the deep echo of that first chord. It was a melody of immense longing, a cry of something beautiful and wounded. It was a real tune, a famous tune, something she felt she should know, a memory from a movie or a commercial. But here it was raw and alive, not trapped in a screen. He wasn't just playing notes now. He was telling a story. His whole body was part of it. His head tilted slightly, listening to the phrases he created. His shoulders moved with the rise and fall of the music. The old, beaten piano was no longer a broken box of wires and wood. Under his hands, it became an orchestra. The left hand rumbled like distant thunder, a powerful rolling foundation. The right hand soared and wept and sang above it. The people in the plaza were statues. The courier had stopped running. The shop assistants had ended their conversation. Every single person within earshot was turned toward the piano, caught in the sudden, unbelievable beauty of it. The man in the tweed coat and the beanie was gone. In his place was a conductor, a magician, a force of nature, and he had only just begun. The first, soaring phrase of the music seemed to hang in the cold air for a heartbeat, a question asked in a language of pure feeling. Then the pianist answered it himself, his left hand crashing down in a wave of deep, resonant chords that rolled through the plaza like physical force. This was no longer just a man playing a tune. This was a storm being built, note by note, right there on the chipped keys of a public piano dot. The change in him was absolute. The hesitant, curled figure was gone. Now, he was a man possessed by the sound he was pulling from the instrument. His head dipped low over the keyboard, then threw back as a particularly powerful chord rang out. The outdated sunglasses hid his eyes, but the set of his jaw, the tight line of his mouth, spoke of a fierce, total concentration. It was as if every ounce of his being was being poured down through his arms and out through his fingertips. The music swelled. It was full of a huge, aching sadness, but there was a terrible strength in it, too. It was the sound of memory, of lost things, of a love so big it hurt. The melody climbed, higher and higher, twisting and turning, never quite letting you settle. Just when it felt like it might break from its own beauty, it would pull back, retreat into a softer, more thoughtful passage, only to gather itself and surge forward again with even more power. People were not just stopping now. They were being stopped. It was like an invisible net had been cast over the whole plaza. A deliver man on a bicycle, cutting through the space, braked so suddenly his back wheels skidded on the concrete. He didn't right himself and move on. He just put a foot down and stared. A group of tourists with matching backpacks froze in a loose huddle, their guide's flag dropping limp by her side. The shop assistants who had been gossiping stood shoulder to shoulder now, their earlier laughter replaced by looks of stunned wonder. The construction worker had taken off his hard hat. He held it in front of his stomach, his rough hands clasping the rim tightly. He wasn't thinking about the afternoon's work, about drywall or conduit. He was thinking of his father, who had loved classical music and played old records on Sunday afternoons, a memory he hadn't visited in years. The music was pulling it out of him. The woman who had asked the question still held her salad bowl, but her arm had gone slack. The plastic fork had fallen to the ground unnoticed. Her earlier impatience, her small frustrations, felt shameful, and tiny now, blown away like dust by the force of this sound. She wasn't seeing a street performer anymore. She was witnessing a kind of miracle. The warm tweed coat, the silly beanie, they were a disguise. This was the real person, finally revealed, and the piano itself, it was transformed. Under his hands, its flaws didn't matter. The buzz of the pedal became a soft, breathing underscore. The slightly out-of-tune strings gave the music a raw, living quality that a perfect concert grand might have lacked. It sounded real. It sounded human. When he pounded the low keys, the whole body of the instrument shuddered, and you could feel the vibration in the soles of your feet. When he played the high, delicate notes, they glittered like ice in the sun. His hands were a blur. They weren't just hitting notes. They were dancing, fighting, embracing. His left hand leaped and bounded across the lower half of the keyboard, laying down a foundation that was complex and rhythmic, more like a heartbeat than a simple accompaniment. His right hand flew, fingers stretching and curling with impossible agility, pulling out ribbons of melody that seemed to twine around each other. The fingerless gloves only made it more astonishing. You could see the tension and release in the muscles of his forearms, the sheer physicality of it. He moved with the music. His whole body was part of the performance. He would lean far to the left, his ear almost touching his shoulder, as if listening to a secret from the deepest bass notes. Then he'd rock forward, driving his weight into a crashing series of chords, the stool groaning in protest. There was no sheet music, no plan to follow. The music was coming from somewhere deep inside him, flowing out in a continuous, breathtaking river. The crowd had grown, and it was utterly silent. 50 people, then 100. They packed in closer, forming a wide, dense circle around the piano. But they kept a respectful distance, as if an invisible barrier surrounded the instrument. No one spoke, no one whispered. The only sounds were the piano and the distant, muffled city, which now seemed a world away. Got an old man leaning on a cane, had tears tracing clean lines through the dust on his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. A young student, headphones dangling around her neck, had her hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide above her fingers. A couple holding hands held on tighter, their argument from 10 minutes ago completely forgotten, lost in the shared experience of this beauty. The music built to a new climax, a furious, passionate crescendo that seemed to shake the very air. The pianist's hands were a storm over the keys, pounding, flying, weaving. It was almost too much to take in. The sound was so big, so full. It felt like the sky itself was pressing down, charged with the emotion of it. And then, with a master's control, he began to pull it back. The fury softened. The torrent became a stream, then a trickle. The melody returned, simpler now, weary but still beautiful, over gentle, rocking chords. It was the calm after the storm. It was a sigh out in the crowd. People were breathing again. They hadn't realized they'd been holding their breath. The construction worker let out a long, shaky sigh of his own. The woman with the salad bowl finally set it down on the ground, her legs feeling weak. The pianist played the final gentle notes of the movement, each one placed with a tender precision. They were soft, rounded, like stones dropped into a still pond. The last note faded into nothing, leaving a silence that was deeper and more profound than any silence that had been there before. He kept his hands on the keys for a moment, his head bowed. The connection was still there, a thread between him and the last vibration of the string. Then he slowly lifted his hands and placed them in his lap. He did not turn to the crowd. He did not take a bow. He simply sat there, in the heart of that immense, waiting quiet, the disguised man once more, surrounded by 100 strangers who felt they now knew his soul. The silence that followed the last note wasn't empty. It was thick. It was full. It was like the air itself had been stretched tight, holding the shape of the music that had just finished. For a few seconds, no one in the crowd made a sound. They didn't dare. It felt like speaking would shatter something fragile, something sacred that had just been built among them. 100 people stood frozen. They weren't looking at each other. Every single pair of eyes was fixed on the man on the piano stool. He was still again, his hands resting in the worn fabric of his trousers, his head bent forward. The powerful figure who had commanded the storm of sound was gone, replaced once more by the hunched, quiet man in the tweed coat. But no one saw him that way now. They saw both people at once, the unremarkable shell and the astonishing artist inside. The spell was broken by a single, sharp intake of breath. It came from the old man with the cane. He let the breath out in a ragged sob, quickly stifled, and used a trembling hand to finally wipe the tears from his face. The sound seemed to wake the crowd from its collective trance, but they didn't erupt into applause. Not yet. What followed was a softer, more human sound. A sigh that seemed to move through the crowd like a wave. It was a release of held emotion. Then came the whispers, hushed and full of awe. "Wow," murmured the young student. The word barely audible. "I've never heard anything like that," a man in a business suit said to no one in particular. Shaking his head slowly, the construction worker just kept repeating, "Holy, holy," under his breath. His hard hat still clutched to his chest. The woman who had asked the question stood rooted to the spot. Her face was pale. Her mind was a jumble. She felt a burning heat of shame in her stomach. Her words, any real music, played over and over in her head, now sounding so foolish and small. But mixed with the shame was a soaring, unbelievable gratitude. She had been the catalyst. Her challenge, born of irritation, had somehow unlocked this. She had provoked a masterpiece. She wanted to say something to him, to apologize, to thank him. But her throat was too tight. People were looking at each other now, strangers sharing a moment of deep understanding. A mother met the eyes of another mother across the circle. They exchanged a look that said, "Asterisk, can you believe this?" Two teenagers who had been filming the whole thing on a phone lowered it, their usual cool detachment replaced by open-mouthed wonder. They weren't watching a screen. They were watching a living, breathing event. The crowd had grown so large, it was blocking the main walkway of the plaza. Newcomers, drawn by the massive, silent gathering, tried to squeeze in, whispering questions. "What's happening? Who is he?" Those who had been there from the beginning answered in hushed, urgent tones. "You just missed it." It was the most incredible. They couldn't even find the words. They just pointed at the pianist, and yet, at the center of it all, he gave no sign that he noticed any of this. He simply sat. He seemed to be gathering himself, his shoulders rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. The applause was building in the crowd, a pressure waiting to be released. People were shifting their weight, getting ready to clap, to cheer, to finally make the noise they felt this performance deserved. But then he moved. He placed his hands back on the keys. A new wave of silence, instant and complete, swept over the plaza. He wasn't finished. This time he began softly. The music wasn't the thunderous, emotional storm of before. This was different. It was lighter, faster, an intricate dance of notes that spilled from the piano like water over smooth stones. It was playful, clever, full of tiny, glittering twists and turns. His fingers danced across the higher keys, so fast they were almost a blur, yet every note was clean and precise. A small, amazed chuckle rippled through a few in the crowd who recognized the piece. It was something joyful and technically dizzying, a showcase of pure, impossible skill. He was showing them another color, another part of his soul. The first piece had been a heart laid bare. This was a mind at play, a celebration of what 10 fingers could do. The crowd watched, mesmerized by the agility, the sheer fun of it. Smiles broke out on faces still wet with tears from the first piece. The construction worker grinned, a big, unreserved grin. The young student laughed out loud at a particularly clever run of notes. He played this for a minute, 2 minutes, the music a sparkling fountain in the cold air. Then, without stopping, he began to weave the two moods together. The playful dance slowed, deepened, and melted back into something richer, more romantic. It was a love song, but a complicated one full of passion and doubt and sweetness all at once. He was taking them on a journey. He was saying, asterisk, you see? It is not just one thing. Music is everything. Feeling and thought, joy and sorrow, strength and tenderness. Asterisk, the crowd was his completely. They had no will of their own anymore. They went where he led. When the music was soft, they leaned in. When it rose to a powerful crest, they stood straighter, their own chests filling with that borrowed air. An older couple, well into their 70s, had moved closer together. The man had his arm around his wife's shoulders, and she had her head resting against him, her eyes closed, just listening. They might have been back in their own living room, 40 years ago, listening to a record dot. This was the magic of it. It wasn't a concert in a hall with expensive tickets. It was here, in the grubby everyday. The music was mixing with the smell of pretzels from a cart, with the cool breeze kicking up dried leaves. It was wrapping around people in their work clothes, with their shopping bags and their tired feet and their worries about the rent or a sick kid. And for these few minutes, all of that fell away. The music lifted it clean off them. He built this new piece to its own magnificent finish, not with crashing force, but with a series of soaring, hopeful chords that seemed to reach up into the gray sky. The final note was high, pure, and sustained, held by the pedal until it faded into a whisper, and then into nothing. Again, the silence. But this silence was different. It wasn't shocked. It was peaceful. It was full. Every person in that crowd felt full of beauty, full of a strange, shared connection. They looked around at the faces of strangers and saw their own feelings reflected back. There were no phones in the air now. Every single device had been put away. This was not for recording. This was for living. The pianist's hand stayed on the keys for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he lifted them. He folded them in his lap. He sat perfectly still in the center of the quiet he had created, a small, still point in a circle of hundreds of captivated hearts. He did not turn. He did not smile. He simply waited, his head bowed, as if listening to the echo of his own music, or perhaps to the beat of the collective heart of the crowd standing breathless behind him. The applause was coming. They all knew it. But for now, this shared, perfect silence was the only tribute that felt right. It was the loudest thank you any of them could possibly give. The perfect silence held for a count of 5 heartbeats. It was a living thing, a shared agreement among everyone in the plaza not to break the spell. The only movement was the slow curl of breath in the cold air, pale clouds forming and vanishing. Then it started dot. It wasn't a single clap. It was a wave. It began with the old man with the cane, who brought his wrinkled hands together with a soft, determined pat. Next to him, the construction worker slammed his palms together, the sound sharp and loud. The young student clapped, tears streaming down her smiling face. The woman who had asked the question was clapping so hard her hands stung, but she didn't feel the pain. In seconds, the applause roared through the plaza, a thunderous, warm, human sound that crashed against the glass of the office towers. It was mixed with whistles and shouts of "Bravo!" and "Yes!" and wordless cries of appreciation. The sound was enormous, but the man at the piano did not turn. He gave no bow. He simply sat there, his back to the roaring crowd, as if the applause was a natural force, a wind or a rain, and he was just a man waiting for it to pass. Slowly, with movements that were tired but precise, he reached out. His gloved fingers found the edge of the worn, faded music stand. He gently closed it with a soft click. The little sign that said, "Play me," was now hidden from view. It was a small, final gesture. He leaned forward and with great care lowered the heavy wooden fallboard over the piano keys. The click of the latch engaging was a tiny sound, lost in the applause, but it felt definitive. The instrument was sealed. The performance was over. He stood up from the stool. For the first time, the crowd saw his full height. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity that made him seem larger. He turned, finally, to face the noise. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. His face, what little could be seen between the beanie and the scarf and the large sunglasses, was unreadable. It wasn't pride or shyness. It looked like a deep, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from giving everything you have. He gave a single, small nod. It wasn't to anyone in particular. It was to the crowd as a whole. A simple acknowledgement. I hear you. Then he looked down at the open case at his feet. The applause began to falter, confused. People expected a speech, a bow, a collection. They were reaching into their pockets, pulling out wallets, ready to stuff the case with bills to show their gratitude. The construction worker had a $20 bill clutched in his rough fist, but the man didn't pick up the case to collect. Instead, he knelt. He gathered the few coins and the single crumpled dollar bill that were already there, the meager take from his hour of clumsy playing. He pocketed them without counting. Then he closed the empty case, snapping the latches shut. He picked up the case. He picked up the folding stool. He tucked it under his arm dot, and then he simply walked. He walked directly toward the crowd that was still applauding, now more out of habit than anything else. The applause sputtered into a confused, murmuring silence as people realized he was leaving. Just like that dot, the crowd parted for him. It was like the sea splitting. They moved back on both sides, creating a narrow pathway. Their faces were a blur of emotion as he passed awe, confusion, gratitude, a desperate desire to connect. The mother reached out as if to touch his sleeve, but pulled her hand back, thinking better of it. The young student opened her mouth to say, "Thank you," but the words died in her throat as he passed, his eyes hidden behind the dark lenses. Looking straight ahead, he walked at a steady, even pace. Not fast, not slow. He didn't look left or right. He moved through the corridor of people as if he were alone, as if he were just another man walking home after a long day. The only sound was the soft scuff of his shoes on the concrete and the rustle of his old coat. He reached the edge of the crowd and stepped back into the normal flow of the plaza. A few people from the back of the crowd followed him for a few steps, but then they stopped. It felt wrong to chase him. He had given his gift. It was complete. He crossed the plaza, a solitary figure with a stool under his arm, becoming smaller with each step. He didn't look back. He turned a corner at the far side, near the bus stop, and was gone. He vanished as completely as he had appeared. For a long moment, the crowd he left behind stood in a loose, quiet cluster around the silent piano. They looked at each other, lost. What do you do after that? How do you just go back to your day? The woman who had asked the question finally moved. She walked slowly to the piano and placed her hand on the closed fallboard, where his hands had been moments before. The wood was cool. The construction worker walked up and put his hand on it too, then the old man. Soon, a dozen people had a hand on the old piano, a silent communion with the ghost of the music that still seemed to hum in its wood. People began to speak, their voices hushed. Who was that? He could be famous. Why is he here? I'll remember this for the rest of my life. Slowly, the crowd began to drift apart. But they didn't drift back into their old separate bubbles. They walked away slowly, thoughtfully. The couple held hands, talking softly about the music. The shop assistants walked back to their store, not gossiping, but discussing which piece they thought the second one was. The world of the plaza began to return. The traffic sounds seeped back in. A phone rang. Someone laughed, but it was different now. It felt softer. The edges had been smoothed out. The old piano sat silent once more in the fading afternoon light. It looked just as it had before, cracked, yellowed, ordinary. But to those who had been there, it was now a monument. A few people, as they left, walked over and dropped money onto the closed lid anyway, a donation to a spirit that had already left. The woman was the last to leave the piano. She picked up her forgotten salad bowl from the ground, the lettuce now wilted and unappetizing. She didn't care. She looked at the spot where the man had disappeared, then back at the piano. She didn't feel shame anymore. She felt changed. The impatient, frustrated person she had been an hour ago felt like a stranger. The city around her, usually so loud and demanding, felt quieter, as if it too was holding its breath, remembering the sound of something real. She walked away, not to her office, but deciding to take the long way back. She needed the walk. She needed to sit with the memory of the music, and the sight of that man simply walking away from all the noise he had created, leaving behind only a profound and echoing silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could.